a contract signed in blood. Katerina DeLuca had spent her life being a weapon, a strategist, a survivor. But when she was stolen in the dead of night, when she woke bound to a chair in a room that smelled of smoke and sin, she knew she had underestimated her enemy. He sat in the shadows, watching her, waiting. "Your father took something from me," he murmured. "So I took you." She lifted her chin. "And what do you plan to do with me?" His lips curved. "Haven't decided yet." Chapter 1. The Serpent's Snare. The limousine glided through the rain-slicked streets of Rome, its interior a cocoon of plush leather and hushed silence. Katerina DeLuca stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and crimson. She was returning from a charity gala, one of those endless social obligations that came with being the daughter of Don Antonio DeLuca. Her father, a man whose name echoed with both respect and fear throughout the city's underbelly, had always insisted on these appearances. "Visibility is power, Katerina," he'd often say, his voice a low rumble that brooked no argument. "Let them see you, but never let them know you." Tonight, however, the usual veneer of calm she wore felt thin, stretched taut by a creeping unease she couldn't quite place. It had started with a fleeting shadow glimpsed in the periphery of her vision at the gala, a figure that seemed to melt into the crowd before she could get a clear look. Then, a whispered conversation overheard between two of her father's lieutenants, abruptly cut short as she approached. The air itself seemed heavy, charged with a tension that prickled at her skin. She adjusted the diamond necklace at her throat, a gift from her father on her 50th birthday. The cold weight of the jewels was usually comforting, a reminder of her family's legacy, their power. Tonight it felt like a shackle. Katerina had spent her life navigating the treacherous currents of the mafia world. She knew the rules, the codes, the unspoken language of violence and loyalty. She was a strategist, a negotiator, a survivor. She'd buried her husband, Marco, 5 years ago, a victim of a rival family's ambition. The grief had been a cold, hard knot in her chest, but she'd learned to carry it, to channel it into a steely resolve. The limousine turned onto a quieter street, lined with ancient, towering plane trees. The rhythmic swish of the wipers was the only sound besides the gentle hum of the engine. Katerina glanced at the driver, Silvio, a man who had been with her family for decades. His face, usually impassive, was etched with a faint line of worry between his brows. "Is everything all right, Silvio?" she asked, her voice low and even. He hesitated for a moment, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "There have been rumors, Signorina." Nothing concrete, but he trailed off, his gaze flicking to the rearview mirror. Before Katerina could question him further, a black SUV slammed into the side of the limousine, the impact sending a violent jolt through the vehicle. The air filled with the screech of metal, the shatter of glass. Katerina was thrown against the door, her head hitting the window with a sickening thud. Disoriented, she struggled to regain her bearings, her vision swimming with black spots. Silvio was shouting, his voice a mixture of fear and rage. Gunshots erupted, loud and deafening in the confined space. Katerina saw Silvio slump forward, a crimson stain blossoming on his white shirt. The world tilted, the sounds of the city fading into a dull roar. Rough hands grabbed her, dragging her from the wreckage. She fought, kicking and scratching, but her strength was no match for the two men who hauled her into the back of the SUV. A cloth was pressed over her mouth and nose, the cloying sweetness of chloroform filling her lungs. Darkness consumed her, swift and absolute. She woke to a throbbing headache and the sensation of being bound. Her wrists were tied tightly behind her back, the rope cutting into her skin. Her ankles were similarly secured. She was sitting in a straight-back chair, the wood hard and unforgiving against her spine. The room was dimly lit, the only source of illumination a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of old tobacco, stale whiskey, and something else, something feral and dangerous. It was a large room, but sparsely furnished. A heavy oak desk sat against one wall, its surface cluttered with papers and a half-empty bottle of amber liquid. A worn leather armchair faced the desk, its back to her. The walls were paneled in dark wood, adorned with faded portraits of stern-faced men in antiquated clothing. A single window, high and narrow, was covered with heavy iron bars. She tested the ropes, pulling against them, but they held fast. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Panic clawed at her throat, but she forced it down, drawing on years of training, of ingrained discipline. Think, Katerina. Assess. Observe. The armchair swiveled slowly, revealing its occupant. He was a silhouette at first, a dark shape against the dim light. Then, as he leaned forward, his features came into focus. He was younger than she expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with a face that was both striking and unsettling. His hair was dark, almost black, and swept back from a high forehead. His eyes, the color of deep sea, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. They were eyes that had seen too much, eyes that held both a chilling coldness and a flicker of something else. His mouth was a thin, cruel line, but as he studied her, it curved into a slow, deliberate smile. It was not a smile of amusement, but of possession, of triumph. "Your father took something from me," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant purr that seemed to vibrate through the room. The accent was subtly different from her own, a hint of the South, perhaps Naples. "So I took you." Katerina lifted her chin, meeting his gaze, without flinching. Years of navigating the treacherous waters of mafia politics, of facing down enemies and rivals, had taught her the power of composure. Fear was a weakness, and she would not show it. "And what do you plan to do with me?" Her voice, surprisingly steady, betrayed none of the turmoil raging within her. His lips curved further, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Haven't decided yet." He rose from the chair, his movements fluid and graceful, like a panther stalking its prey. He circled her slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. He was tall, leanly muscled, and dressed in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light. The air around him crackled with a palpable energy, a dangerous magnetism that both repelled and intrigued her. He stopped in front of her, his shadow falling across her like a shroud. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, the touch sending a shiver down her spine. It was not a gentle touch, but one that held a possessive weight, a clear assertion of dominance. "You are intriguing, Katerina DeLuca," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A woman of fire and ice. A queen in her own right. But even queens can be captured. Even queens can be broken." The unspoken threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Katerina knew, with a chilling certainty, that her life had irrevocably changed. She was no longer the respected daughter of a powerful don, the grieving widow, the shrewd negotiator. She was a pawn in a deadly game, a prize to be won or lost. And the man standing before her, the man who had stolen her from her world, was unlike anyone she had ever encountered. He was a serpent in the garden, a storm on the horizon. He was her captor. And something told her, deep in her gut, that he was also something far more dangerous. Something she couldn't yet name, a feeling that was a terrifying, thrilling blend of fear and fascination. Chapter 2. Echoes of Lost Empires. The silence that followed his words stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken implications. Katerina held his gaze, refusing to yield, even as a tremor of fear ran through her. She studied him, searching for any weakness, any clue to his intentions. His face was a mask, revealing nothing but a cold, calculating intelligence. And yet, there was that flicker again, that hint of something else buried deep within those fathomless eyes. "What did my father take from you?" she asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. She needed information, needed to understand the game she was now a part of. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent another shiver down her spine. "Patience, mia regina." All in good time. He moved away from her, returning to the desk. He poured himself a generous measure of the amber liquid from the bottle, the clink of glass against glass sharp in the quiet room. He took a long swallow, his eyes never leaving hers. "This house," he said, gesturing around the room with his glass, "has seen centuries of secrets, of betrayals, of love." He paused, the word hanging in the air, laced with a subtle irony. "It belonged to my ancestors, the Rossi family. Once, we were as powerful as the De Lucas. More powerful, some would say." Katerina knew the name. The Rossi family. A legend, a ghost story whispered in the corridors of power. They had been a dominant force in the Neapolitan Camorra centuries ago, before a bloody feud with the De Lucas had decimated their ranks, leaving them scattered and broken. The feud was ancient history, a tale told to frighten children, but the echoes of that violence still resonated in the present. "Ancient history," she said, her voice dismissive. "My father has nothing to do with the sins of our ancestors." He smiled again, that slow, predatory smile that made her skin crawl. "Perhaps. But history has a way of repeating itself, doesn't it? The sins of the fathers are often visited upon the children. And the daughters." He set the glass down with a decisive thud. "My name is Alessandro Rossi, and I intend to reclaim what is rightfully mine."
Alessandro.
The name resonated with a dark power, a legacy of violence and ambition. Katerina felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. This was not a simple kidnapping, a ransom demand. This was something far more complex, far more dangerous. This was a vendetta, a resurrection of an ancient feud, and she was caught in the middle of it. He began to pace again, his movements restless, like a caged animal. "Your father built his empire on the ruins of mine. He took our land, our businesses, our respect." His voice hardened, the underlying anger surfacing. "He thought he had erased us. But he was wrong." Katerina watched him, her mind racing. She knew her father was a ruthless man, a man who had climbed to the top of the mafia hierarchy through cunning and force. But she had always believed there was a code, a sense of honor, even among thieves. Alessandro Rossi seemed to operate outside those rules, driven by a primal need for revenge that transcended logic and reason. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice calm despite the fear that gnawed at her. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes blazing with intensity. "I want everything your father took, and more." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, lingering on her face, her neck, the curve of her body. "I want retribution." The way he said the word, the way he looked at her, sent a chill down her spine. It was a look of hunger, of possessiveness, but it was also something more, a dark, twisted fascination that both terrified and intrigued her. She realized, with a sinking feeling, that she was not just a bargaining chip in his quest for revenge. She was something else, something personal. He moved closer, his presence filling the room, overwhelming her senses. The scent of his smoke, whiskey, and something indefinably male was intoxicating and unsettling. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the subtle tension in his muscles. He reached out and touched a strand of her hair, twirling it between his fingers. "You are a beautiful woman, Katerina.
Strong.
Intelligent. A worthy adversary." He leaned in, his voice a whisper that brushed against her ear. "But you're also my prisoner. And I always get what I want." The threat was clear, the challenge laid down. Katerina met his gaze, her own eyes narrowed. She would not be broken. She would not show fear. She would survive this. She would find a way to escape, to turn the tables on him. She was a De Luca, and De Lucas did not surrender. But even as she clung to that resolve, a flicker of doubt, of something akin to anticipation, stirred within her. Alessandro Rossi was a dangerous man, a predator. But he was also undeniably compelling, a force of nature that had swept into her life and shattered her carefully constructed world. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. The game had just begun, and the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. The echoes of lost empires were stirring, and the future was a dark, uncertain abyss. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Obsidian Night. The first night was the longest. Sleep evaded Katerina, her mind a whirlwind of fear, anger, and a strange, unsettling curiosity about her captor. The ropes binding her wrists and ankles chafed against her skin, a constant reminder of her helplessness. The room, with its heavy, oppressive atmosphere, felt like a tomb. Alessandro had left her alone after his chilling pronouncements, disappearing into the depths of the house. She had heard distant sounds, the murmur of voices, the clink of glasses, the occasional burst of laughter, but they offered no comfort, only a heightened sense of isolation. She replayed their conversation in her mind, dissecting every word, every gesture, searching for a weakness, a vulnerability. Alessandro's claim of a family vendetta was a credible threat, a dangerous game of power and retribution. Yet, there was something else, something more personal in his gaze, in the way he touched her. It was a possessiveness that went beyond mere revenge, a dark fascination that both terrified and intrigued her. As the hours crawled by, the initial surge of adrenaline faded, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. She leaned her head back against the chair, her eyes tracing the patterns of the wood paneling on the walls. The faces of the men in the portraits seemed to stare down at her, judging, condemning. They were the ghosts of Alessandro's ancestors, the specters of a lost empire. She thought of her father, of the life she had always known. The opulent villa overlooking the Bay of Naples, the endless social gatherings, the hushed conversations about business and power. It all seemed so distant now, a world apart from this dark, suffocating room. She thought of Marco, her late husband, a kind, gentle man, caught in the crossfire of a world he never truly understood. His death had left a void in her life, a cold emptiness that she had filled with work, with duty, with a steely resolve to never be vulnerable again. But now, facing this new threat, this unpredictable enemy, that resolve was crumbling. Alessandro Rossi was unlike anyone she had ever encountered. He was a force of nature, a storm that threatened to consume her. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the narrow, barred window, casting long shadows across the room, Caterina heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Her heart quickened its pace. She straightened her back, summoning her strength, preparing for another confrontation. The door opened, and Alessandro entered, his presence filling the room with that same unsettling energy. He was dressed in a fresh suit, his dark hair impeccably styled. He looked rested, refreshed, while she felt like a wrung-out dish rag. He stopped in front of her, his eyes studying her with that same unnerving intensity. "Did you sleep well, Mia Regina?" he asked, his voice laced with mockery. "As well as can be expected, considering the circumstances," she replied, her voice cool and even. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "I admire your spirit, Caterina. Your defiance. It makes this more interesting." He gestured to a tray that a young woman, barely more than a girl, was carrying into the room. The girl, her eyes downcast, placed the tray on the desk and hurried out, avoiding Caterina's gaze. The tray held a simple breakfast, a cup of strong, black coffee, a plate of fresh fruit, and a crusty roll. The aroma of the coffee was tantalizing, a reminder of the world outside, of normalcy. Alessandro poured himself a cup of coffee and took a sip, his eyes never leaving Caterina. "You must be hungry," he said. "I wouldn't want my guests to starve." Caterina glared at him. "Untie me and I will eat." He smiled, that slow, predatory smile.
"Patience, Mia Regina."
All in good time. He picked up a knife and sliced a piece of fruit, offering it to her. She hesitated for a moment, her pride warring with her hunger. The smell of the fresh fruit was overwhelming. She finally relented, opening her mouth to accept the offering. He fed her slowly, deliberately, his fingers brushing against her lips. The intimacy of the act was unsettling, a strange dance of power and vulnerability. He watched her as she ate, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You are different from what I expected," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Stronger. More resilient. And you are exactly what I expected," she retorted. "A brute. A kidnapper." He laughed softly. "Perhaps. But I am also a man of my word. I told you I would reclaim what is rightfully mine. And I will. By holding me hostage? She challenged. That is the act of a coward. His eyes flashed with anger, but he quickly regained control. This is not about cowardice, Katerina. This is about justice. About settling old scores. He finished feeding her, then poured her a cup of coffee. He held the cup to her lips, forcing her to meet his gaze. Drink, he commanded. She took a sip, the hot liquid burning her throat. The caffeine jolted her awake, sharpening her senses. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and something else. Something she couldn't quite define, a flicker of curiosity, of unwilling admiration. He set the cup down and leaned closer, his face inches from hers. You intrigue me, Katerina DeLuca, he whispered. I see the fire in your eyes, the strength beneath the surface. You are a worthy opponent, but you are also a woman. His gaze lingered on her lips, and a shiver ran through her. She felt a strange pull, a magnetic force drawing her towards him. It was a dangerous feeling, a forbidden attraction that she knew she had to resist. He straightened up, breaking the spell. Think about what I said, Katerina. About the sins of the fathers. About the price of loyalty. He turned and walked towards the door. I will return later. We have much to discuss. He left, leaving her alone again in the silence of the room. But the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with his presence, with the echo of his words, with the unsettling feeling of his gaze. The whispers in the obsidian night had begun, and Katerina knew that her life was forever changed. She was trapped, but she was not broken. And she would find a way to navigate this dangerous game, to survive, to perhaps even win. The seeds of a plan, a desperate gamble, began to take root in her mind. Chapter 4. The Scent of Smoke and Sin. The day passed slowly, marked only by the changing light filtering through the barred window and the occasional sounds from other parts of the house. Katerina spent the time stretching her cramped muscles, testing the ropes that bound her, and formulating a plan. Escape seemed impossible, at least for now. The house was a fortress, and she was under constant surveillance. Her thoughts kept returning to Alessandro. He was a complex, contradictory figure, a man driven by both a cold, calculating ambition and a burning passion for revenge. She couldn't deny the strange pull she felt towards him, the unsettling mixture of fear and fascination. It was a dangerous attraction, a forbidden fruit, and she knew she had to resist it. In the late afternoon, Alessandro returned. He was accompanied by a man she hadn't seen before, a tall, imposing figure with a scarred face and eyes that were as cold as ice. This is Lorenzo, my lieutenant, Alessandro said, gesturing towards the man. He will be overseeing your care. Lorenzo nodded curtly, his gaze sweeping over Katerina with a dismissive appraisal. He exuded an aura of menace, a silent threat that made her skin crawl. Alessandro dismissed Lorenzo with a flick of his hand, and the man retreated, leaving them alone. Alessandro circled her, his eyes assessing, probing. Have you thought about our conversation? He asked, his voice low and smooth. I've thought about the fact that I am being held against my will, Katerina retorted, her voice tight with anger. That you are a criminal. He cut her off with a raised hand. Enough. I grow tired of your insults. Let us speak plainly, Katerina. You know why you are here. You know the history between our families. History is history, she said, her voice defiant. I am not responsible for the actions of my ancestors. Perhaps not. But you're a symbol, Katerina. A symbol of the DeLuca power, of the DeLuca legacy. And by holding you, I am striking at the heart of that legacy. You think my father will give you what you want? She challenged. You underestimate him. Alessandro smiled, that slow, predatory smile. I don't underestimate him, Katerina. I know he is a ruthless man. But I also know he values his family. His daughter. The unspoken threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Katerina felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She knew her father loved her, in his own way. But she also knew he was a pragmatist, a man who made decisions based on cold, hard logic. Would he sacrifice his empire, his power, to save her? "What is it you want, Alessandro?" she asked, her voice losing some of its defiance. She needed to know his demands to understand the parameters of this deadly game. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes blazing with intensity. "I want the Rossi holdings returned. The businesses, the land, the respect that was stolen from us." "That's impossible," she said, shaking her head. "Those things are long gone, absorbed into my father's empire." "It's been generations. Nothing is impossible, Katerina," he interrupted, his voice hardening. "With the right leverage." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, lingering on her face, her neck. "And you, Mia Regina, are my leverage." He moved closer, his presence filling the room, overwhelming her senses. The scent of him smoke, whiskey, and that indefinable male musk was intoxicating and unsettling. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. The touch sent a shiver down her spine, a complex mix of fear and something else. "I could make your life very comfortable here, Katerina," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You could have anything you want. Luxury, comfort, even companionship." The implication was clear. He was offering her a choice. Cooperate, become his mistress, and live a life of gilded captivity. Or resist and face the consequences. She met his gaze, her own eyes narrowed. "I will never be your mistress, Alessandro. I would rather die." He laughed softly, a chilling sound. "Such fire, Mia Regina. Such defiance."
It amuses me.
He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. "But defiance can be broken, Katerina. Loyalty can be tested." He turned and walked towards the door, leaving her alone again. But his words, his presence, lingered in the air, a suffocating weight. The scent of smoke and sin filled the room, a constant reminder of her predicament. As darkness fell, Katerina felt a growing sense of despair. She was trapped, isolated, at the mercy of a dangerous man. But she was also a DeLuca. And DeLucas did not break easily. She would fight. She would resist. She would find a way to survive, to escape, to turn the tables on her captor. Even if it meant playing his game, using his own desires against him. A plan began to form in her mind, a desperate gamble, but one that might just be her only chance. She would use his attraction to her, his twisted fascination, as a weapon. It was a dangerous game, a dance with the devil, but she was willing to risk everything to regain her freedom. The night was dark, but a flicker of hope, of defiance, still burned within her. Chapter 5. Masks of Civility and Deceit. The next few days fell into a strange, unsettling routine. Alessandro visited her each day, sometimes twice, bringing her meals, engaging her in conversations that ranged from casual banter to intense interrogations. He seemed to be testing her, probing her weaknesses, trying to break her resolve. He untied her only for meals and brief periods of exercise, always under the watchful eye of either him or Lorenzo. The small freedoms were a torment, a reminder of what she had lost. The house itself was a labyrinth of opulent rooms, filled with antique furniture, priceless artwork, and the ghosts of Alessandro's ancestors. She glimpsed other members of his household servants, guards, other men who seemed to be part of his inner circle, but they avoided her gaze, their faces carefully blank. Katerina played the role he had assigned her, the defiant captive, the proud DeLuca. She met his gaze, parried his questions, refused to show any sign of weakness. But beneath the surface, she was observing, analyzing, planning. She noticed the patterns of the household, the comings and goings of the guards, the layout of the rooms. She listened to every conversation, every whisper, gleaning any information she could. She also began to study Alessandro himself. He was a master of masks, of shifting personas. One moment he would be charming, almost gentle, engaging her in discussions about art, music, literature. He had a surprisingly vast knowledge of these subjects, a cultured side that seemed at odds with his ruthless nature. The next moment, he would turn cold, distant, reminding her of her captivity, of the power he held over her. She realized that his attraction to her was genuine, but it was also a weapon, a tool he used to manipulate her. He would touch her, a hand on her arm, a brush of his fingers against her cheek, a lingering gaze sending shivers down her spine, unsettling her composure. It was a deliberate tactic, a way to keep her off balance, to remind her of her vulnerability. One evening, he brought her a dress, a stunning gown of deep crimson silk. "I want you to join me for dinner," he said, his voice smooth and commanding. A social engagement. Katerina hesitated. It was a trap, she knew, another move in his game. But she also saw it as an opportunity. A chance to observe him in his own environment, to gather more information, to perhaps even find a way to contact the outside world. "I have nothing suitable to wear," she said, gesturing to her simple, rumpled clothing. He smiled, that slow, predatory smile. "I have taken care of everything." He held out the dress, the silk shimmering in the dim light. She took the dress, her fingers brushing against his. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a strange mixture of fear and excitement. She hated him. She despised his arrogance, his cruelty, but she couldn't deny the physical pull, the dark fascination he held for her. She dressed in a small, adjoining room, the silk cool and smooth against her skin. The dress fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. It was a statement, a symbol of his control, but it also made her feel powerful. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a different woman. Not the captive, the victim, but a queen, a warrior, ready to face her enemy. When she emerged, Alessandro was waiting for her, his eyes dark with appreciation. He was dressed in a tailored black suit that accentuated his lean, muscular physique. He looked devastatingly handsome. "You look magnificent," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Don't expect me to be grateful," she retorted, her voice cool and even. He chuckled softly. "I expect nothing, Katerina, except your company." He offered her his arm, and she hesitated for a moment before taking it. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down her spine. They walked through the house, a silent, tense procession. The other members of his household watched them, their faces carefully blank, but she could sense their curiosity, their suspicion. They entered a large, opulent dining room, lit by crystal chandeliers. A long table was set with fine china, gleaming silverware, and sparkling crystal glasses. Several other men were already seated, all dressed in expensive suits. They rose as Alessandro and Katerina entered, their eyes assessing her with a mixture of curiosity and something else. Something that made her skin crawl. These were his lieutenants, his inner circle, the men who carried out his orders. They were dangerous men, she knew, men who had blood on their hands. But tonight, they were playing the role of civilized gentlemen, engaging in polite conversation, exchanging pleasantries. Alessandro introduced her simply as Katerina, omitting her last name. The men greeted her with a mixture of deference and veiled hostility. She sensed their resentment, their suspicion of her presence. She was an outsider, a threat, a potential weakness. The dinner was a lavish affair, course after course of exquisitely prepared food, accompanied by expensive wines. The conversation flowed around her, a mixture of business discussions, political gossip, and veiled threats. Katerina listened, observed, playing the role of the silent, attentive companion. She learned more about Alessandro's operations, his ambitions, his rivals. She also saw the cracks in his facade, the underlying tension, the constant vigilance. He was a man who lived on the edge, a man who trusted no one. As the evening wore on, she felt a growing sense of unease. The masks of civility were slipping, the veneer of deceit wearing thin. She sensed a danger lurking beneath the surface, a threat that was directed not just at her, but at Alessandro himself. He was playing a dangerous game, and she was caught in the middle of it. The dinner was a performance, a show of power, but it was also a test. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the night was far from over. The scent of smoke and sin was stronger than ever, mingled with the aroma of expensive food and wine, a toxic cocktail of power, betrayal, and desire. Chapter 6. a cage of gilded iron. The days that followed the formal dinner settled into an unsettling rhythm, a strange blend of captivity and something else. Katerina remained a prisoner, her movements restricted, her every action monitored. But Alessandro's behavior towards her shifted subtly. He was still her captor, still the man who held her life in his hands, but he also treated her with a growing respect. He continued to bring her meals, to engage her in conversations, to test her limits. But the conversations became more personal, less about the vendetta between their families, more about their individual lives, their beliefs, their desires. He spoke of his childhood, of his early years in Naples, of the weight of his family's legacy. He spoke of his ambition, his drive to restore the Rossi name to its former glory. He also spoke of his loneliness, of the isolation that came with power. He had no family, no close friends, only the men who served him, men who were bound to him by loyalty and fear. He had never married, never allowed himself to be vulnerable to anyone. Katerina listened, observed, and slowly, reluctantly, began to understand him. He was a product of his environment, a man shaped by violence and betrayal. He had been raised to be ruthless, to trust no one, to seize power by any means necessary. But beneath the surface, she sensed a flicker of something else, a longing for connection, for something more. She also began to reveal more of herself, her own story. She spoke of her childhood, of her sheltered upbringing in the De Luca villa, of her arranged marriage to Marco, of her grief and her determination to survive. She spoke of her love for her family, her loyalty to her father, but also of her growing disillusionment with the mafia world, with its violence and its endless cycle of revenge. These conversations were a dangerous dance, a delicate balancing act. They were both revealing their vulnerabilities, their secrets, but they were also wary, guarded, always aware of the power dynamic between them. Alessandro continued to touch her, those small, seemingly casual gestures that sent shivers down her spine. A hand on her arm, a brush of his fingers against her cheek, a lingering gaze. The touches were becoming more frequent, more intimate. She knew he was testing her, pushing her boundaries, trying to break down her resistance. And she was resisting, but it was becoming harder. She hated him, she despised his actions, but she couldn't deny the physical pull, the dark fascination he held for her. It was a dangerous game, a forbidden attraction, and she was playing with fire. The house itself became both her prison and her refuge. She explored its many rooms, its hidden corners, learning its secrets. She discovered a library, a vast collection of books that spanned centuries. She spent hours there, losing herself in the pages, finding a temporary escape from her reality. She also discovered a garden, a hidden oasis behind the house, walled off from the outside world. It was a wild, overgrown space, filled with ancient trees, fragrant flowers, and the sound of birdsong. It was a place of peace, of tranquility, and she found herself drawn to it, seeking solace in its beauty. One afternoon, she was sitting in the garden, reading, when Alessandro found her. He stood for a moment, watching her, his expression unreadable. Then he sat down beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You seem to find solace in this place," he said, his voice low and soft. "It is peaceful," she replied, her voice equally quiet. "Peace is a rare commodity in our world," he said, a hint of sadness in his voice. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. The air was warm, fragrant with the scent of flowers. It was a moment of truce, a temporary respite from the tension that always simmered between them. "You could have a life here, Katerina," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A life of comfort, of companionship." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She knew what he was offering. A gilded cage, a life as his mistress, his possession. But it was also an escape from the uncertainty, the danger, of her current situation. "And what about my family?" she asked, her voice tight with emotion. "What about my father?" He sighed, a heavy sound. "Your father will have to adjust. He will have to accept that you are no longer his. The words were a blow, a reminder of her helplessness. She was a pawn in his game, a prize to be won or lost. But she was also something more. She was a woman, with her own desires, her own will. "I will never be yours, Alessandro," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. "Not in the way you want." He looked at her, his eyes dark with a mixture of anger and something else. Something that looked almost like disappointment. "We shall see, Mia Regina," he said, his voice a low growl.
"We shall see."
He stood up and walked away, leaving her alone in the garden. The peace was shattered, the tranquility replaced by a renewed sense of danger. The cage was gilded, but it was still a cage. And she knew that the game was far from over. She was trapped, but she was not broken. And she would continue to fight, to resist, to find a way to escape, even if it meant playing his game, using his own desires against him. The stakes were higher than ever, and the line between captor and captive was becoming increasingly blurred. Chapter 7. The Ghost of a Forgotten Promise. Days turned into weeks, and Katerina's captivity continued, the strange, unsettling rhythm of her life with Alessandro solidifying. The house, once a menacing fortress, began to feel almost familiar. The opulent rooms, the silent servants, the watchful guards, they were all part of her new reality, a reality she was determined to change. Her interactions with Alessandro continued to be a complex dance of defiance, manipulation, and a growing, undeniable attraction. He was her captor, her enemy, but he was also the only person she could truly talk to, the only one who seemed to understand, even if he didn't approve of her fierce independence. One afternoon, Alessandro found her in the library, poring over an ancient text about the history of Naples. He stood for a moment, watching her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You have a thirst for knowledge, Caterina," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It is admirable." "Knowledge is power," she replied, without looking up. "And I need all the power I can get." He chuckled softly. "Indeed. But power comes in many forms, Mia Regina." He moved closer, his presence filling the room, his scent that intoxicating blend of smoke, whiskey, and something uniquely him wrapping around her. He reached out and gently turned her face towards him, his fingers lingering on her cheek. Her heart quickened its pace, a betraying flutter that she tried to suppress. She met his gaze, her own eyes narrowed, defiant. "What do you want, Alessandro?" she asked, her voice a low, controlled whisper. His eyes searched hers, probing, seeking. "I want to understand you, Caterina. To understand what drives you, what makes you so resilient." "I am driven by loyalty," she said, her voice firm. "By a desire for justice. By a need to survive." "And what about love?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The question caught her off guard. Love. It was a word that seemed foreign in this dark, twisted world they inhabited. She thought of Marco, her late husband, a good man, a kind man, but a man she had never truly loved with a fiery passion she now felt stirring within her. A passion she knew was dangerous, forbidden, directed at the very man who held her captive. "Love is a luxury I cannot afford," she said, her voice tight with emotion. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes dark and unreadable. Then, he leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Perhaps you have simply never found the right kind of love, Caterina." The words, the proximity, sent a shiver down her spine. She pulled away, breaking the spell. "Don't play games with me, Alessandro. I know what you are." He smiled, that slow, predatory smile that always sent a thrill of fear, and something else, through her. "And what am I, Mia Regina? A kidnapper, a criminal, a man who uses others for his own gain." "Perhaps," he said, his voice a low growl. "But I am also a man who keeps his promises." The statement surprised her. Promises? What promises? She thought of his vow to reclaim his family's legacy, to avenge the wrongs of the past. But there was something else in his voice, something deeper. "What promise are you referring to?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting away from hers. He walked towards the window, looking out at the garden, his back to her. There was a pact, he said, his voice strained. Between my grandfather and yours. A promise of alliance. Of marriage. Katerina stared at him, stunned. Marriage? An alliance between the Rossi and DeLuca families? It seemed impossible, given the history of violence and betrayal between them. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice a bewildered whisper. He turned back to face her, his expression grim. It was a secret agreement made many years ago. A way to end the feud, to unite our families. My grandfather offered my hand in marriage to your father's future daughter. Katerina felt a chill run through her. She was the daughter. She was the promised bride. This was a revelation, a twist in the narrative she hadn't anticipated. It explained Alessandro's possessiveness, his claim that she was rightfully his. It was a ghost of a forgotten promise, rising from the past to haunt her present. My father never mentioned this, she said, her voice shaking.
Alessandro shrugged.
He chose to ignore it, to break the pact, to solidify his own power instead of seeking peace. And you intend to enforce this ancient agreement? She asked, her voice filled with disbelief. He moved towards her, his eyes blazing with intensity. I intend to reclaim what is mine, Katerina. In every way. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. You are mine, Mia Regina. By right. By destiny. The words, the touch, sent a wave of conflicting emotions crashing through her. Fear, anger, confusion, and a strange, undeniable thrill. She was trapped, not just by physical walls, but by a legacy of violence, by a forgotten promise, by a destiny she had never chosen. But she was also drawn to him, to the dangerous, passionate man who held her captive. She was a pawn in his game, but she was also something more. The line between captor and captive, between enemy and lover, was blurring with every passing day. And she knew that she was standing on the precipice of a choice, a decision that would change her life forever. Chapter 8. Scars Beneath the Surface. The revelation of the ancient pact between their families hung heavy in the air, a silent, unspoken presence in every interaction between Katerina and Alessandro. It changed the dynamic, adding another layer of complexity to their already fraught relationship. She was no longer just a captive, a bargaining chip. She was, in his eyes, a promised bride, a key to reclaiming his family's lost legacy. Alessandro's behavior became even more possessive, more intimate. He sought her out more often, spending hours with her in the library, the garden, even in her room, which he had begun to furnish with small luxuries, books, silks, a comfortable armchair. He seemed determined to win her over, to break down her resistance, not through force, but through a strange, unsettling blend of coercion and courtship. Katerina, in turn, found herself increasingly conflicted. She hated him for her captivity, for the threat he posed to her family, but she also felt a growing understanding of his motivations, his pain, the weight of the legacy he carried. She saw the scars beneath the surface, the wounds that had shaped him, the loneliness that haunted him. One evening, he found her in her room, staring out the window at the darkening sky. She was wearing one of the silk robes he had given her, a deep emerald green that complemented her dark hair and eyes. He stood behind her, close enough that she could feel his breath on her neck. He didn't touch her, but his presence was overwhelming, filling the room with his energy. You are troubled, Mia Regina, he said, his voice low and soft. She didn't turn around. I am a prisoner, Alessandro. Of course I am troubled. He sighed, a heavy sound. You are more than that, Katerina. You know you are. She finally turned to face him, her eyes flashing with anger. I am a pawn in your game, a means to an end. Don't pretend otherwise. He met her gaze, his own eyes dark and intense. And what if I told you that you are more than that? That you are becoming more than that? The words, the vulnerability in his voice, caught her off guard. She searched his face, looking for any sign of deceit, of manipulation. But she saw only sincerity. A raw, unguarded emotion that she hadn't seen before. "I don't understand you, Alessandro," she said, her voice a confused whisper. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. The touch sent a shiver down her spine, a complex mix of fear and desire. "I am a man of contradictions, Katerina."
I know that.
"I am both a monster and a man." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "I have lived my life in darkness, surrounded by violence and betrayal. I have never known tenderness.
Until now."
The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Katerina felt her heart quicken its pace, a betraying flutter that she couldn't control. She was drawn to him, to the darkness and the light that warred within him. It was a dangerous attraction, a forbidden fruit, and she knew she should resist it. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't say these things." He leaned closer, his face inches from hers.
Why not?
"Are you afraid, Katerina? Afraid of what you feel?" She was afraid. Afraid of him, afraid of herself, afraid of the emotions that were swirling within her, threatening to consume her. She was a DeLuca, and he was a Rossi. They were enemies, destined to be on opposite sides of a bloody feud. But they were also something else. Something more. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a slow, tentative kiss at first, a gentle exploration. Then, it deepened, becoming more passionate, more demanding. She responded, hesitantly at first, then with a growing fervor. Her arms went around his neck, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. She was kissing her captor, her enemy, the man who held her life in his hands. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the feel of his lips on hers, the taste of him, the heat of his body pressed against hers. The kiss went on and on. It was a kiss of desperation, a kiss of longing, a kiss of surrender. It was a kiss that acknowledged all the darkness, the violence, the history that separated them, but also the undeniable connection that bound them. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily, their bodies trembling. Katerina stared at him, her eyes wide with shock and something else. Something that looked very much like desire. He touched her cheek again, his fingers lingering on her lips. "Don't be afraid, Katerina," he whispered. "Don't be afraid of what we are together." He turned and left the room, leaving her alone with her racing heart, her confused emotions, and the lingering taste of his kiss. The scars beneath the surface had been exposed, the hidden wounds revealed. And Katerina knew that she had crossed a line, a point of no return. She was still his captive, but she was no longer just a pawn. She was something more, something dangerous. And the game had just changed, irrevocably. Chapter 9. The Dance of Shadows and Light. The kiss changed everything. It was a turning point, a moment of surrender and defiance, a blurring of the lines between captor and captive. The air between Katerina and Alessandro crackled with a new intensity, a palpable tension that was both terrifying and exhilarating. They didn't speak of the kiss, but it hung between them, a silent acknowledgement of the forbidden desire that simmered beneath the surface. Alessandro's behavior became even more complex, a mixture of possessiveness, tenderness, and a lingering ruthlessness. He continued to treat her as a prisoner, restricting her movements, monitoring her actions, but he also sought her out, engaging her in conversations, sharing his thoughts, his feelings, in a way he never had before. Katerina found herself increasingly drawn to him, despite her better judgment. She hated his actions, his world, the violence that surrounded him, but she couldn't deny the pull, the magnetic force that drew her towards him. She saw the darkness in him, the ruthlessness, but she also saw the vulnerability, the loneliness, the flicker of something good that he tried so hard to hide. She began to challenge him more, pushing his boundaries, questioning his motives, his actions. She argued with him about the vendetta, about his treatment of her, about his plans for the future. These arguments were often heated, passionate, ending in a stalemate, but they also served as a strange form of intimacy. They were connecting even in their conflict. One afternoon, she found him in the garden, staring out at the city sprawling below. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape. She stood beside him, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth of his body.
What are you thinking about?
She asked, her voice soft. He turned to her, his eyes dark and troubled. I am thinking about the future, he said, his voice a low murmur. About what I want. About what we could have. She looked at him, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and fear. There can be no future for us, Alessandro. Not like this. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw.
Why not?
Are you so afraid of breaking the rules, Katerina? Of defying your family? Of loving me? The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning.
Love.
It was a dangerous word, a forbidden word, but it was also the truth, a truth she could no longer deny. She was falling in love with her captor, with her enemy, with the man who held her life in his hands. I am afraid, she admitted, her voice trembling. But not of defying my family. I am afraid of losing myself, of becoming someone I don't recognize. He smiled, a sad, wistful smile. Perhaps you are simply becoming who you were always meant to be, Katerina. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. We could build a new world, you and I. A world of power, of passion, of love. The temptation was overwhelming. To surrender, to give in to the desire that consumed her, to accept his offer, his world, his love. But she knew it was a trap, a gilded cage, a world built on violence and betrayal. I can't, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I can't betray my family. I can't condone your actions. He sighed, a heavy sound. You are a stubborn woman, Katerina De Luca. A woman of principle. A woman of fire. He paused, his gaze searching hers. But you're also mine. He kissed her then, a kiss that was both fierce and tender, a kiss that spoke of possession and longing, of darkness and light. She responded, her arms going around his neck, her body pressing against his. It was a kiss of desperation, a kiss of surrender, a kiss that sealed their fate. They were dancing on the edge of a precipice, caught in a web of desire and betrayal, of shadows and light. They were enemies, destined to be on opposite sides of a bloody feud, but they were also lovers, bound by a forbidden passion, a dangerous attraction that threatened to consume them both. As darkness fell, they remained in the garden, locked in their embrace, the city lights twinkling below them like fallen stars. The dance of shadows and light had begun, and Katerina knew that there was no turning back. She had made her choice, a choice that would lead to either salvation or destruction. She had chosen to love her enemy, to embrace the darkness, to risk everything for a chance at something more. The future was uncertain, dangerous, but for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. Chapter 10. A flicker of defiance. Despite the undeniable passion that had ignited between them, Katerina remained Alessandro's prisoner. The gilded cage was still a cage, and the reality of her situation was a constant, nagging presence. The kiss, the shared moments of vulnerability, hadn't erased the fundamental power imbalance, the threat he posed to her family, the violence that permeated his world. She continued to play the role of the defiant captive, challenging him, questioning him, pushing his boundaries. But now, there was a new layer to her defiance, a flicker of hope, a belief that she could somehow influence him, change him, steer him away from the path of destruction he was on. She used their intimacy, their shared moments of vulnerability, to try to understand him better, to get him to open up about his plans, his motivations. She learned more about his operations, his network of contacts, the rivalries and alliances that shaped the underworld he inhabited. She also began to subtly, cautiously, plant seeds of doubt, of dissent. She questioned his methods, his reliance on violence, his obsession with revenge. She spoke of the possibility of peace, of compromise, of a different way of life. Alessandro listened, sometimes with amusement, sometimes with anger, sometimes with a flicker of something else. Something that looked almost like hope. He was a man torn between two worlds, the world of his ancestors, of violence and vendetta, and the world Katerina represented, a world of possibility. One evening, they were having dinner together in her room. It had become a ritual of sorts, a strange, intimate space where they could be themselves, away from the watchful eyes of his men. "You have been quiet tonight, Mia Regina," Alessandro said, his voice a low murmur. He was watching her intently, his eyes dark and searching. "I have been thinking," she replied, her voice equally quiet, "about us. About this situation." He raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his expression. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "I have reached the conclusion that this cannot continue," she said, her voice firm. "This captivity. This war between our families." He sighed, a heavy sound. "You are a dreamer, Katerina. An idealist. You believe in a world that does not exist." "It could exist," she insisted. "If you were willing to change. If you were willing to choose a different path." His eyes flashed with anger. "Change? I am who I am, Katerina. I am Arasi. I am bound by my legacy, by my duty." "Duty to what?" she challenged. "To violence? To revenge? To a cycle of bloodshed that will never end?" He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He paced the room, his movements restless, agitated. "You do not understand, Katerina. You cannot understand. This is the way of the world. The way of our world. It doesn't have to be," she said, her voice rising. "There is another way. A way of peace. Of forgiveness." He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes blazing with intensity. "Forgiveness? You ask me to forgive the men who murdered my family? Who destroyed our legacy? I ask you to break the cycle," she said, her voice pleading. "To choose a different future. For yourself. For us." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Us. It was a dangerous word, a forbidden word, but it was also the truth. They were connected, bound by a forbidden passion, by a shared destiny. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned away, his shoulders slumping. "I cannot," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am not strong enough." It was the first time she had ever heard him admit weakness, vulnerability. It was a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the man beneath the mask. She stood up and went to him, placing a hand on his arm. He flinched at her touch, but he didn't pull away. "You are strong, Alessandro," she said, her voice soft, gentle. "Stronger than you know. You just need to choose to be." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain, longing, and something else. Something that looked very much like love. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "You see something in me, Katerina," he whispered. "Something that I don't even see in myself." He kissed her then, a kiss that was different from the previous ones. It was not a kiss of possession, of dominance, but a kiss of surrender. A kiss that acknowledged his vulnerability, his need, his love for her. She responded, her arms going around his neck, her body pressing against his. It was a kiss of hope, a kiss of defiance, a kiss that challenged the darkness, the violence, the legacy that had defined him. A flicker of defiance had been ignited. A change may have been impossible, but the desire for something more had created a ripple. He was still her captor, but the chains were slowly being unraveled, thread by thread. Chapter 11. Broken vows and shattered trust. The fragile truce, the tentative steps towards understanding, were shattered by a single, devastating event. News arrived, brought by a breathless, panicked Lorenzo, that Antonio De Luca had made a move. He had orchestrated an attack on one of Alessandro's key businesses, a crippling blow that threatened to destabilize his entire operation. Alessandro was enraged. The vulnerability he had shown, the flicker of hope that Katerina had ignited, vanished, replaced by a cold, hard fury. He saw her father's actions as a betrayal, a confirmation of his belief that the DeLucas were irredeemable, that peace was impossible. He stormed into Katerina's room, his face a mask of fury. "Your father," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He dares to attack me? While I am entertaining his daughter." Katerina stared at him, stunned. She knew her father was ruthless, but she hadn't expected this, not while she was still Alessandro's captive. It was a reckless move, a dangerous escalation that put her life, and the lives of many others, at risk. "I didn't know," she stammered, her voice trembling. He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Don't play innocent with me, Katerina. You are a DeLuca. You are all the same. Liars. Traitors." The words were a blow, a physical assault. The trust, the fragile connection they had built, shattered into a million pieces. She saw the suspicion, the hatred, return to his eyes, the darkness that she had hoped, briefly, she had begun to dispel. "I had nothing to do with this, Alessandro," she pleaded, her voice rising. "I swear to you." He grabbed her arm, his grip tight, painful. "Don't lie to me. You are a pawn in his game, just like you have always been. A distraction. A whore." The insult stung, a cruel, deliberate wound. She wrenched her arm free, her eyes flashing with anger. "How dare you? I am not a whore. I am not a pawn. I am—" She stopped, her voice catching in her throat. She was about to say, "I am your lover," but the words died on her lips. The reality of her situation crashed down on her, the weight of her captivity, of the violence that surrounded them, of the impossible gulf that separated them. He stared at her, his eyes cold, distant. "You are nothing to me, Katerina. Nothing but a tool. A means to an end." He turned and walked towards the door, his back rigid with anger. "You will remain confined to this room," he said, his voice harsh, "until I decide what to do with you." He left, slamming the door behind him, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. Katerina stood there, trembling, her heart shattered. The hope, the fragile dream of a different future, had been crushed. The vows of the past had been broken and trust evaporated. She sank onto the bed, her body racked with sobs. She had been foolish, naive, to believe that she could change him, that she could bridge the gap between their families, that she could escape the cycle of violence and revenge. She was a prisoner again, more isolated, more vulnerable than ever before. Alessandro's trust, his tentative steps towards her, had been an illusion, a cruel deception. He was a Rossi, and she was a DeLuca, and their worlds were destined to collide, to destroy each other. As darkness fell, she felt a renewed sense of despair, a cold emptiness that threatened to consume her. But beneath the despair, a flicker of defiance still burned. She was a DeLuca, and DeLucas did not break easily. She would not surrender. She would not give up. She would find a way to survive, to escape, even if it meant facing him, fighting him, destroying him. The game had changed, and the stakes were higher than ever. She had lost his trust, his love, but she had not lost her will to fight. The battle lines had been redrawn, and the war was far from over. Chapter 12. The Weight of Unspoken Words. The days following Alessandro's enraged outburst were filled with a heavy, suffocating silence. Katerina remained confined to her room, the door guarded, her only contact with the outside world the silent servants who brought her meals. She was a prisoner again, in every sense of the word, the fragile hope of connection, of understanding, completely shattered. She spent the time pacing the room, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the situation, trying to find a way out. She replayed every conversation with Alessandro, every touch, every kiss, searching for any clue, any sign that she had misread him, that the vulnerability he had shown had been a lie. But she couldn't escape the truth. She had seen something in him, something real, something beyond the mask of ruthlessness he wore. She had seen his pain, his loneliness, his longing for something more. And she had, foolishly, allowed herself to believe that she could reach him, that she could change him. She thought of her father, of his reckless attack on Alessandro's business. She knew he had done it to protect his own interests, to maintain his power, regardless of the consequences for her. He had used her as a pawn, a sacrifice, and the realization filled her with a bitter resentment. She also thought of Marco, her late husband, a kind, gentle man, caught in the crossfire of a world he never understood. She had never loved him with a fiery passion she felt for Alessandro, but she had respected him, cared for him, and she had mourned his loss, the loss of the life they could have had. As the hours crawled by, she realized that she was alone, truly alone. She had no one to rely on, no one to turn to. Her family had betrayed her, and the man she had loved had rejected her, condemned her. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a stranger. A woman haunted by shadows, by loss, by a forbidden love that had turned to ashes. She was a DeLuca, a Rossi, a captive, a lover. She was a woman caught between two worlds, two destinies, and she had no idea how to navigate the treacherous path ahead. One evening, Lorenzo, Alessandro's lieutenant, entered her room without knocking. He stood there, his scarred face impassive, his eyes cold. "Alessandro wants to see you," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Caterina's heart quickened its pace. She hadn't seen Alessandro since his outburst, since he had condemned her, called her a whore. She didn't know what to expect, what he planned to do with her. She followed Lorenzo through the house, her steps measured, her head held high. She would not show fear. She would not show weakness. She would face him, whatever the consequences. They entered the library, the room where she had spent so many hours with Alessandro, the room where their connection had begun to blossom. He was standing by the window, his back to her, looking out at the city lights. He turned as she entered, his face a mask. He looked tired, drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper than before. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. There was an ocean of unspoken feelings between them. "You wanted to see me," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. He nodded curtly. "I have made a decision," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "About your future." Her heart clenched. She knew what was coming. He was going to send her back to her father, a broken, defeated woman. Or worse, he was going to kill her. "And what is that decision?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He walked towards her, his steps measured, deliberate. He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the familiar scent of smoke and whiskey. "I am going to use you," he said, his voice a low growl. "As you were always meant to be used. As a weapon." The words were a blow, a confirmation of her worst fears. He had never seen her as anything more than a tool, a means to an end. The connection she had felt, the vulnerability he had shown, had all been a lie, a cruel deception. But then, he did something unexpected. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. The touch was tender, almost loving. It was a contradiction, a flicker of the man she had glimpsed beneath the mask. "But not in the way you think," he added, his voice softening, his eyes searching hers. The weight of unspoken words filled the room. What did he mean? He didn't want her to go, but he couldn't let her stay either. She needed to leave, and yet she was the only person who understood the dark prison in his soul. The tension was a heavy cloak, smothering them both, making it impossible to break free. Chapter 13. Beneath the veneer of power. The ambiguity of Alessandro's words hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope in the midst of despair. Caterina searched his face, trying to decipher the meaning behind his statement, the flicker of tenderness in his touch. What did he mean by using her, but not in the way she thought? "Explain yourself, Alessandro," she said, her voice a low, controlled whisper, despite the tremor of uncertainty that ran through her. He sighed, a heavy sound, and turned away from her, walking back towards the window. He stood there for a long moment, his back to her, his shoulders tense. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken emotions. "My father," he finally said, his voice strained, "has made his move. He has escalated the conflict. He has declared war." Caterina nodded, her heart sinking. She had expected this, feared it. Her father's actions had sealed her fate, placed her in an even more precarious position. "And you believe I had a part in it," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. He turned back to face her, his eyes dark and troubled. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Katerina. I've been betrayed so many times, by so many people I find it difficult to trust anyone." The admission surprised her. It was a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the vulnerability he usually kept so carefully hidden. She saw the pain in his eyes, the loneliness, the weight of the legacy he carried. "I did not betray you, Alessandro," she said, her voice firm, sincere. "I had nothing to do with my father's actions." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching hers. He seemed to be weighing her words, assessing her honesty. The tension in the room was palpable, a thick, suffocating presence. "I want to believe you, Katerina," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to believe you." The words were a revelation, a fragile bridge across the chasm that separated them. He was admitting his need, his vulnerability, his dependence on her. "Then what do you plan to do?" she asked, her voice softening, her heart aching with a mixture of hope and fear. He moved towards her, his steps slow, deliberate. He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel his breath on her face. "I need your help," he said, his voice a low murmur. "To end this.
To stop the bloodshed."
The request stunned her. He was asking for her help? After everything that had happened, after he had accused her of betrayal, of being a pawn in her father's game? How can I help you?" she asked, her voice bewildered. "You know your father," he said, his eyes intense, searching. "You know his weaknesses, his strategies, his network. You can help me anticipate his moves. You can help me end this war before it consumes us all." He was asking her to betray her father, to betray her family, to side with her captor, her enemy. It was an impossible request, a dangerous proposition. But it was also an opportunity, a chance to stop the violence, to save lives, to perhaps, finally, find a way out of this nightmare. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice trembling. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. The touch sent a shiver down her spine, a complex mix of fear and desire. "I would never force you, Katerina," he said, his voice soft, sincere. "But I believe you want this to end as much as I do." He was right.
She did want it to end.
She was tired of the violence, the bloodshed, the endless cycle of revenge. She wanted peace, a normal life, a future free from the shadows of the past. "I will help you," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "But on one condition." He raised an eyebrow, a hint of curiosity in his expression. "And what is that condition?" "That you promise me," she said, her eyes meeting his, unwavering, "that no harm will come to my father. That you will seek a peaceful resolution. That you will end the violence." It was a bold demand, a risky gamble. But she had to try. She had to protect her family, even if it meant siding with her enemy. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "I promise," he said, his voice a low, solemn vow. "I will do everything in my power to end this peacefully. And I will protect your father if you help me." It was a fragile agreement, a tentative truce, built on a foundation of mutual need and a shared desire for something more. Katerina had chosen to trust him, to believe in him, despite everything. It was a dangerous gamble, a leap of faith, but it was the only choice she had. Beneath the veneer of power, a new alliance had been forged. Chapter 14. A glimmer of forbidden hope. With the agreement struck, a new dynamic emerged between Katerina and Alessandro. They were no longer simply captor and captive, nor were they enemies in the traditional sense. They were allies, bound by a shared goal, a mutual desire to end the violence that had consumed their families for generations. Katerina moved freely within the house, no longer confined to her room. She had access to Alessandro's library, his office, even his war room, where he and his lieutenants planned their strategies. She became an active participant in their discussions, offering insights into her father's thinking, his weaknesses, his network of contacts. At first, Alessandro's men were suspicious, resentful of her presence. They saw her as an outsider, a threat, a potential spy. But Katerina slowly, patiently, earned their respect, if not their trust. She demonstrated her knowledge, her intelligence, her loyalty to Alessandro. Lorenzo, Alessandro's lieutenant, remained the most skeptical, the most hostile. He watched her constantly, his eyes filled with suspicion, his silence a constant reminder of the danger she was in. Alessandro, however, treated her with a newfound respect, a growing affection. He sought her out, listened to her advice, confided in her in a way he never had before. He seemed to rely on her, to depend on her strength, her intelligence, her calming presence. The intimacy between them deepened, growing beyond the physical attraction, the forbidden desire that had initially drawn them together. They spent hours talking, sharing their thoughts, their fears, their dreams. They discovered a shared love for art, for music, for literature. They found common ground, a connection that transcended their family's feud, their vastly different backgrounds. Katerina saw a different side of Alessandro, a side he had kept hidden from the world. She saw the man beneath the mask, the vulnerability, the loneliness, the flicker of goodness that he tried so hard to suppress. She saw his desire for peace, for a different life, a life free from violence and betrayal. And she realized, with a growing certainty, that she was in love with him. Deeply, irrevocably in love. It was a forbidden love, a dangerous love, but it was also the most powerful, the most real emotion she had ever felt. One evening, they were standing on the balcony, overlooking the city. The air was warm, fragrant with the scent of flowers from the garden below. Alessandro was silent, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Katerina touched his arm, a gentle, comforting gesture.
What are you thinking about?
She asked, her voice soft. He turned to her, his eyes dark and troubled. I am thinking about the future, he said, his voice a low murmur. About what will happen after this is over. She knew what he was asking. He was asking about them, about their future together. It was a question she had been avoiding, a question that filled her with both hope and fear. I don't know, Alessandro, she said, her voice trembling. I don't know what the future holds. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. I want a future with you, Katerina, he said, his voice intense, passionate. A future together. A future free from this darkness. The words were a balm to her soul, a confirmation of the love she felt for him. But she also knew it was a dream, a fragile hope that could easily be shattered. It's not that simple, Alessandro, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Our family's the past, it's too much. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. We can overcome it, Katerina. Together, we can build a new future, a new legacy. He kissed her then, a kiss that was both desperate and tender, a kiss that spoke of longing, of hope, of a love that defied all odds. She responded, her arms going around his neck, her body pressing against his. It was a kiss that sealed their commitment, their shared dream of a future free from violence, from hatred, from the shadows of the past. A glimmer of forbidden hope had been ignited, a fragile flame in the darkness. They were walking a dangerous path, a tightrope between two worlds, but they were walking it together. And for the first time since her captivity began, Katerina felt a sense of possibility. A sense that, perhaps, they could find a way out of the darkness, a way to a future where love, not hate, would prevail. Chapter 15. The Price of Loyalty and Love. The fragile alliance between Katerina and Alessandro, the glimmer of hope for a future together, was constantly threatened by the realities of their world. The war between their families continued, escalating with each passing day. Alessandro's men, despite their grudging respect for Katerina, remained wary, their loyalty to him unwavering. And Katerina's own family, her father, his lieutenants, were a constant, unseen presence, a threat that hung over them like a dark cloud. Caterina continued to provide Alessandro with valuable information, insights into her father's strategies, his weaknesses. She walked a tightrope, balancing her loyalty to her family with her love for Alessandro, her desire for peace. She knew that every piece of information she shared, every suggestion she made, could have devastating consequences, could lead to bloodshed, to death. Alessandro, in turn, struggled to keep his promise to her, to seek a peaceful resolution, to protect her father. He was a man of violence, a man raised on a code of revenge, and the pressure from his own men, from his own ingrained instincts, was immense. One evening, Lorenzo, Alessandro's lieutenant, confronted him, his face grim, his eyes filled with suspicion. "We cannot trust her, Alessandro," he said, his voice harsh. "She is a DeLuca. She is playing you, using you to protect her father." Alessandro slammed his fist on the table, his anger flaring. "She is helping us, Lorenzo. She is providing us with information that could end this war. Or she is feeding us lies," Lorenzo retorted, his voice unwavering. "Leading us into a trap." Caterina, who had been standing nearby, listening to the exchange, stepped forward. "I am not lying, Lorenzo," she said, her voice calm, but firm. "I want this to end, just as much as you do. I want peace." Lorenzo stared at her, his eyes cold, assessing. "Peace? There can be no peace with the DeLucas. Only victory. Or defeat." Alessandro placed a hand on Lorenzo's arm, a calming gesture. "We will find a way, Lorenzo," he said, his voice softer. "We will find a way to end this, without more bloodshed." Lorenzo shook his head, his expression skeptical. "I do not believe it is possible. But I will follow your lead, Alessandro." As always, the exchange highlighted the fragility of their situation, the constant threat of betrayal, the deep-seated mistrust that permeated their world. Caterina knew that she was walking on eggshells, that one wrong move, one misstep, could shatter the fragile alliance, could lead to disaster. Later that night, Alessandro found her in the garden, sitting alone, staring out at the city lights. He sat down beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. "I am sorry, Caterina," he said, his voice low and troubled, "for the way my men treat you, for the doubts they have." "It's not your fault, Alessandro," she said, her voice equally quiet. "It's the nature of this world, of our families, of the past." He sighed, a heavy sound. I wish things were different," he said, his voice filled with longing. "That we could escape this. That we could be together, without all this baggage." She turned to him, her eyes searching his. She saw the pain in his eyes, the weariness, the yearning for something more. "We can try, Alessandro," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We can try to build a different future. A future together." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. The touch was electric, a spark of hope in the darkness. "I love you, Caterina," he said, his voice a low, passionate whisper. "I love you more than anything in this world." The words were a balm to her soul, a confirmation of the love she felt for him. She leaned closer, her head resting on his shoulder. "I love you too, Alessandro," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. They sat there for a long time, holding each other, the city lights twinkling below them like fallen stars. The price of loyalty and love was high, the path ahead uncertain, but in that moment, they found solace in each other's arms, a fragile hope for a future that seemed almost impossible to achieve. The weight of their world pressed down on them, but their love, their shared dream, was a flickering flame in the darkness, a beacon of hope that refused to be extinguished. Chapter 16. Threads of Fate Unraveling. Despite their shared desire for peace, the external pressures continued to mount, threatening to tear Caterina and Alessandro apart. Antonio DeLuca, enraged by Caterina's perceived betrayal and Alessandro's refusal to retaliate with full force, escalated his attacks. He targeted Alessandro's businesses, his allies, even his personal life, leaving a trail of destruction and bloodshed. Alessandro, caught between his love for Caterina and the demands of his men, his ingrained need for revenge, struggled to maintain his composure, his commitment to a peaceful resolution. He was being pushed to the edge, his control fraying, the darkness within him threatening to consume him. Katerina, witnessing his struggle, felt a growing sense of despair, a fear that their dream of a future together was slipping away. She knew that she was the only one who could reach him, the only one who could pull him back from the brink. But she also knew that her influence was limited, that the forces arrayed against them were powerful, relentless. One evening, a coded message arrived from one of Katerina's contacts within her father's organization. It was a warning, a desperate plea. Antonio De Luca was planning a major attack, a final, decisive blow that would cripple Alessandro's empire and, most likely, result in his death. Katerina knew she had to act, quickly and decisively. She went to Alessandro, the message clutched in her hand, her heart pounding with fear and determination. "Alessandro," she said, her voice urgent, "we have a problem. My father, he's planning something big. Something devastating." Alessandro took the message, his eyes scanning the coded words. His face hardened, his jaw clenching. He recognized the threat, the imminent danger.
"When?"
he asked, his voice a low growl. "Soon," Katerina replied, her voice trembling. "Very soon. We don't have much time." Alessandro looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, fear, and something else. Something that looked very much like gratitude. "You are risking everything for me, Katerina," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "I am risking everything for us," she replied, her voice equally quiet. "For the future we dreamed of." He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "I will not let him hurt you, Katerina," he said, his voice fierce, resolute. "I will protect you. I will end this." He turned and summoned his men, his voice sharp, commanding. He outlined the threat, the imminent attack, and laid out his plan, a counteroffensive designed to neutralize her father's forces and, hopefully, bring an end to the war. Lorenzo, however, objected. "This is madness, Alessandro," he said, his voice harsh. "We cannot trust this information. It is a trap. She is leading us into an ambush." Alessandro glared at him, his eyes blazing with anger. "I trust Katerina," he said, his voice unwavering. "She is with us. She is one of us." Lorenzo shook his head, his expression skeptical, but he obeyed, reluctantly. The men prepared for battle, their faces grim, determined. The house was filled with a tense, expectant energy, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and fear. Katerina watched them, her heart aching with a mixture of dread and hope. She had made her choice. She had chosen to side with Alessandro, to betray her father, to risk everything for a chance at a different future. But she also knew that the price of that choice could be devastating, that the threads of fate were unraveling, leading them towards an uncertain, potentially catastrophic climax. As darkness fell, Alessandro turned to her, his eyes filled with a love that transcended the violence, the hatred, the legacy that had defined them. "Stay here, Katerina," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Stay safe. I will come back for you." He kissed her then, a kiss that was both passionate and desperate, a kiss that spoke of love, of hope, of a future that might never be. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, a farewell and a promise. He left with his men, disappearing into the night, leaving Katerina alone in the silent house, her heart filled with a mixture of terror and anticipation. The threads of fate were unraveling, and the final confrontation was at hand. Chapter 17. Reckoning in the Rain. The night was a symphony of chaos. The silence of the house was shattered by the distant sounds of gunfire, explosions, and the screams of men. Katerina paced her room, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She listened to the sounds of the battle, trying to decipher what was happening, trying to gauge Alessandro's chances of survival. Every gunshot felt like a blow to her own body, every explosion a threat to the fragile hope she still clung to. She imagined Alessandro, leading his men, fighting for his life, for their future. She imagined her father, commanding his forces, driven by a ruthless ambition, a desire for revenge that knew no bounds. Hours passed, an eternity of waiting, of uncertainty. The sounds of the battle intensified, then gradually subsided, replaced by an eerie silence. Katerina stood by the window, staring out at the rain-slicked streets, her body trembling, her breath caught in her throat. The rain was falling steadily, a relentless downpour that mirrored the turmoil within her. It washed away the blood, the grime, the evidence of the violence, but it couldn't cleanse the fear, the despair, the uncertainty that consumed her. Finally, as dawn approached, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching her door. Her heart leaped with a mixture of hope and dread. Was it Alessandro? Or was it one of her father's men, come to take her, to punish her for her betrayal? The door opened, and Lorenzo stepped into the room, his face grim, his clothes stained with blood and mud. He looked exhausted, defeated, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and something else. Something that looked almost like respect. Katerina stared at him, her breath caught in her throat.
Alessandro?
She whispered, her voice barely audible. Where is he? Lorenzo hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting away from hers. Then, he looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, unmasked emotion. He saved us, Lorenzo said, his voice hoarse, strained. He stopped your father. He ended the war. Relief washed over Katerina, a wave of emotion so intense it almost brought her to her knees. Alessandro was alive. He had survived. He had won. But then, she saw the look in Lorenzo's eyes, the grief, the resignation. And she knew something was wrong, terribly wrong. But, she whispered, her voice trembling. But what, Lorenzo? What happened? Lorenzo swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat.
He was wounded, he said, his voice breaking.
Badly wounded. We did everything we could, but he didn't need to finish the sentence. Katerina understood. Alessandro was dead. Her love, her hope, her future gone. Shattered. She staggered back, her legs giving way beneath her. She sank to the floor, her body racked with sobs. The pain was unbearable, a crushing weight that threatened to suffocate her. Lorenzo stood there, watching her, his own eyes filled with tears. He had never trusted her, had always seen her as an enemy, a threat. But in that moment, he saw her grief, her loss, her love for Alessandro. And he understood. He knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort. He spoke of you, Lorenzo said, his voice choked with emotion. In his final moments, he said he loved you. He said he had found peace. The words were a small comfort, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. Alessandro had loved her. He had found peace. But it wasn't enough. It couldn't fill the void, the emptiness, the gaping wound in her heart. The rain continued to fall, washing away the blood, the violence, the remnants of the battle. But it couldn't wash away the grief, the loss, the devastating reality of Alessandro's death. The reckoning had come, the war was over, but the price had been too high. Katerina was left alone, in the silent house, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, the shattered remnants of a dream that would never be. The rain fell, a mournful lament for a love lost, a future stolen, a hope extinguished. Chapter 18. The Unveiling of Hidden Truths. The days following Alessandro's death were a blur of grief, of numbness, of a hollow ache that seemed to permeate every fiber of Katerina's being. She moved through the house like a ghost, haunted by memories, by the echoes of his laughter, his voice, his touch. The opulent rooms, once filled with a tense, forbidden energy, now felt empty, cold, devoid of life. Lorenzo, surprisingly, became her protector, her confidant. He had witnessed Alessandro's final moments, had heard his last words, and he seemed to understand, to respect, the depth of Katerina's love for him. He took on the responsibility of managing Alessandro's affairs, of dealing with the aftermath of the war, of ensuring her safety. He also revealed a truth that stunned Katerina, a secret that Alessandro had kept hidden until the very end. He had not killed Antonio De Luca. Despite the provocation, despite the demands of his men, he had kept his promise to Caterina. He had captured her father, disarmed him, and arranged for him to be exiled, sent away to a remote location, stripped of his power, his influence, but alive. He did it for you, Caterina, Lorenzo said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and resentment. He sacrificed everything for you. The revelation was a bittersweet comfort. Alessandro had kept his word, had honored his promise, even at the cost of his own life. He had chosen love over revenge, peace over violence. But it didn't bring him back. It couldn't fill the void, the emptiness he had left behind. Caterina decided to visit her father. Lorenzo arranged for her to be transported to the remote villa where Antonio De Luca was being held under house arrest. It was a modest dwelling, a far cry from the opulent palace he had once ruled. She found him sitting on the terrace, staring out at the sea. He looked older, diminished, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and defeat. He had lost everything, his power, his empire, his daughter. He turned as she approached, his expression hardening. "So," he said, his voice a low growl, "the traitor returns. Have you come to gloat?" Caterina met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and pity. "I did not betray you, father," she said, her voice calm, but firm. "I tried to save you. I tried to stop the bloodshed." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You chose him over me," he said, his voice filled with accusation.
You chose that Rossi.
"That murderer." "He was not a murderer, father," Caterina said, her voice trembling. "He spared your life. He could have killed you, but he didn't. He kept his promise to me." Antonio stared at her, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be struggling to comprehend her words, to reconcile them with his own beliefs, his own hatred. "He spared me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Caterina nodded.
He did.
He loved me, father. And I loved him." The admission hung in the air, a heavy, unspoken truth. Antonio looked away, his shoulders slumping. He seemed to deflate, the anger, the defiance, draining away, replaced by a weary resignation. I underestimated him," he finally said, his voice a low murmur. "I underestimated you." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crashing of the waves against the shore. The gulf between them remained, the years of mistrust, of resentment, of opposing loyalties. But there was also a flicker of understanding, a recognition of the shared loss, the shared grief. Caterina left him there, alone with his regrets, his shattered dreams. She returned to the house that had been Alessandro's, the house that was now hers. The unveiling of hidden truths had begun, and the weight of the past was slowly, painfully, being lifted. She was still grieving, still lost, but she was also free. Free to choose her own path, to forge her own destiny, to build a new life, a new legacy, from the ashes of the old. Chapter 19. Crossroads of Destiny and Desire. Caterina spent weeks navigating the complex aftermath of Alessandro's death and the end of the war between their families. She had inherited not only his estate, but also the leadership of his organization, a position she had never sought, never anticipated. It was a daunting responsibility, a world filled with danger, with intrigue, with the constant threat of betrayal. Lorenzo, surprisingly, became her most trusted advisor, her right hand. He had witnessed Alessandro's transformation, his love for Caterina, his desire for peace, and he seemed determined to honor his late leader's wishes, to help her build a new future, a new legacy. He guided her through the intricacies of the organization, introduced her to the key players, helped her navigate the treacherous waters of the underworld. He also protected her, fiercely, from those who sought to challenge her authority, to exploit her vulnerability. Caterina, in turn, proved to be a surprisingly capable leader. She had inherited Alessandro's intelligence, his strategic mind, his charisma, but she also brought her own strengths to the table, her compassion, her empathy, her unwavering commitment to peace. She began to transform the organization, slowly, subtly, shifting its focus from violence and revenge to legitimate businesses, to community development, to building a better future. She negotiated truces with rival families, forged alliances, sought to create a more stable, more peaceful environment. She also faced opposition, resistance, from those who clung to the old ways, who resented her leadership, who saw her as an outsider, a weak woman who had no place in their world. But she met their challenges head-on, with courage, with determination, with a steely resolve that surprised even herself. One evening, she was working late in Alessandra's office, poring over documents, trying to unravel a complex financial scheme. Lorenzo entered, his face grim, his eyes filled with concern. "We have a problem, Katerina," he said, his voice low and urgent. "There is dissent. Some of the men, they are not happy with your leadership.
They are planning something."
Katerina sighed, a heavy sound. She had expected this, feared it. The old guard, the men who had been loyal to Alessandra's father, who believed in the old ways, were not going to accept her easily.
"Who are they?"
she asked, her voice calm but firm. "And what are they planning?" Lorenzo hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting away from hers. Then, he looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. "It's Marco's brother," he said, his voice strained. "Antonio. He believes he should be the leader. He is gathering support. He is planning to challenge you." The news was a blow, a betrayal. Antonio had always been close to Alessandro, had been one of his most trusted lieutenants. But he had also been ambitious, ruthless, a man who believed in power in violence. Katerina felt a surge of anger, of frustration. She had tried to build a new future, a new legacy, based on peace, on cooperation. But the past, the old ways, kept rearing their ugly heads, threatening to drag her back into the darkness. "We have to stop him, Lorenzo," she said, her voice hardening. "We have to prevent this. We cannot allow another war, another cycle of bloodshed." Lorenzo nodded, his expression grim. "I agree, but it will not be easy. He has support. He has weapons." Katerina stood up, her mind racing. She had a choice to make, a crossroads to navigate. She could surrender, give up her leadership, return to the sheltered life she had once known. Or she could fight, defend her position, risk everything for the future she believed in. She looked at Lorenzo, her eyes filled with a steely resolve. "We will fight," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "We will not surrender. We will protect what Alessandro built. We will build a better future." Lorenzo smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his scarred face. "I knew you would say that, Katerina," he said, his voice filled with respect. "I will stand with you. We will fight together." The crossroads of destiny and desire had been reached. Katerina had made her choice, a choice that would determine her future, the future of the organization, the future of everyone she cared about. She was no longer the captive, the pawn, the grieving widow. She was a leader, a warrior, a woman who had found her strength, her purpose, in the midst of chaos, of loss, of a forbidden love that had changed her forever. She was ready to fight, to defend her legacy, to build a new world from the ashes of the old. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The confrontation with Antonio was swift, brutal, and inevitable. He had gathered his supporters, a group of disgruntled men who resented Katerina's leadership, who yearned for the old ways, the days of violence and unchecked power. They launched a surprise attack on the house, hoping to catch Katerina and Lorenzo off guard, to seize control of the organization. But Katerina and Lorenzo were prepared. They had anticipated the move, had gathered their own loyal forces, men who believed in Katerina's vision, who had witnessed her strength, her compassion, her commitment to peace. The house, once a sanctuary, a place of forbidden love, became a battlefield. Gunfire echoed through the opulent rooms, shattering the silence, the memories, the fragile hope of a different future. Katerina, armed with a pistol Alessandro had given her, fought alongside Lorenzo and her men, defending her home, her legacy, her future. She moved with a grace, a determination, that surprised even herself. She had never been a fighter, had always relied on her intelligence, her strategic mind. But now, faced with the ultimate test, she discovered a strength, a courage she never knew she possessed. She saw Lorenzo fall, wounded by a bullet, his face contorted in pain. Rage surged through her, a fierce, protective instinct. She rushed to his side, shielding him with her body, firing at his attackers. "Stay down, Lorenzo," she commanded, her voice sharp, unwavering. "I've got you." She fought with a ferocity that surprised even her, driven by a love for Alessandro's memory, by a loyalty to the men who had chosen to follow her, by a determination to build a better future. The battle raged, a chaotic dance of death and destruction. Caterina saw men fall, on both sides, victims of the endless cycle of violence she had hoped to break. The weight of their deaths, the futility of the conflict, pressed down on her, threatening to crush her spirit. Finally, she came face to face with Antonio. He stood in the library, the room where she had spent so many hours with Alessandro, the room where their love had blossomed. He was holding a gun, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and desperation. "It ends here, Caterina," he said, his voice harsh, his hand trembling. "You were never meant to lead. You are a weak woman, a traitor." Caterina met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and pity. "It doesn't have to end like this, Antonio," she said, her voice calm but firm.
"We can stop this. We can choose peace."
He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Peace? There is no peace with your kind. Only victory. Or defeat." He raised his gun, aiming it at her heart. Caterina closed her eyes, bracing for the impact, for the finality of death. She thought of Alessandro, of his love, of his sacrifice, of the future they had dreamed of. But the shot never came. Instead, she heard a thud, a groan, and then silence. She opened her eyes and saw Antonio lying on the floor, a knife protruding from his back. Standing behind him was Lorenzo, his face pale, his body shaking, but his eyes filled with a fierce determination. He had saved her life, had killed Antonio, had ended the threat. Caterina rushed to Lorenzo's side, helping him to sit down, tending to his wound. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Lorenzo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something that looked very much like love. I could not let him hurt you, Caterina," he said, his voice strained. I owe you everything." The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties had ended. The battle was over. Caterina had won. But the victory was bittersweet, stained with blood, with loss, with the realization that the cycle of violence was difficult, perhaps impossible, to break. She had survived, but at a great cost. She had lost Alessandro, had faced betrayal, had witnessed the brutal reality of the world she had inherited. But she had also found her strength, her courage, her purpose. She was no longer the captive, the pawn, the grieving widow. She was a leader, a warrior, a woman who had chosen to fight for a better future, for a world where love, not hate, would prevail. The final confrontation had tested her, broken her, but it had also made her whole. Epilogue. 5 years later, Caterina stood on the balcony of the villa, overlooking the city of Naples. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape, a scene that had once been a backdrop to captivity and forbidden love, now a vista of peace and hard-won freedom. The city had changed, and so had she. The organization, once synonymous with violence and fear, had been transformed. Under Caterina's leadership, guided by Lorenzo's unwavering support, it had become a force for good, investing in legitimate businesses, creating jobs, supporting the community. The old ways, the cycle of revenge, had been broken, replaced by a fragile, but enduring, peace. Caterina had not forgotten Alessandro. His memory lived on, in her heart, in her actions, in the legacy she was building. She often visited the small, private cemetery where he was buried, a peaceful oasis overlooking the sea. She would talk to him, sharing her triumphs, her struggles, her loneliness. She had not remarried. The love she had shared with Alessandro had been too profound, too transformative, to be replaced. She had found a different kind of love, a deep, abiding affection for Lorenzo, her trusted advisor, her friend, her protector. They had built a life together, a partnership based on mutual respect, on shared goals, on a deep understanding forged in the crucible of violence and loss. Lorenzo joined her on the balcony, his arms slipping around her waist, a familiar, comforting gesture. He had recovered from his wound, but the scar remained, a reminder of the battle they had fought, the price they had paid. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice a low murmur, his gaze fixed on the sunset. Katerina nodded, her head resting against his shoulder. "It is," she said, her voice soft, filled with a mixture of peace and longing. They stood there for a long time, watching the colors fade, the stars begin to appear. The city lights twinkled below them, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to rebuild, to transform, to find hope in the midst of darkness. Katerina had found her purpose, her strength, her peace. She had honored Alessandro's memory, had built a new legacy, a new future, from the ashes of the old. She was no longer the captive queen, the pawn in a deadly game. She was a leader, a survivor, a woman who had chosen love over hate, peace over violence. She had found a new kind of love, a quiet, enduring affection for Lorenzo, a man who had stood by her, protected her, helped her to build a better world. It was not the fiery passion she had shared with Alessandro, but it was a love that was just as real, just as profound. As darkness enveloped the city, Katerina felt a sense of completion. The journey had been long, arduous, filled with loss, with betrayal, with heartbreak. But she had arrived. She had found her place, her purpose, her home. She turned to Lorenzo, her eyes meeting his, a silent understanding passing between them. They had built a life together, a future that had once seemed impossible. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the night, Katerina knew that she was free. Truly free. At peace with the past, with the present, and with the future. The end.